Part 1. The Town That Waits. They called it Miners Hollow. Not a town, not anymore, just the fading skeleton of what it used to be. A brittle row of decaying buildings and sunken rooftops, half devoured by trees and swallowed in shadow, waiting at the edge of the world like a half-remembered nightmare. The sign was still there, leaning sideways, carved into splintering wood, "Welcome to Miners Hollow, EST 1851. No population count. Just a black smear where the number used to be. I shouldn't have come. But I did." The trail started with a voicemail. Static-laced and buried deep in the dead air of a disconnected number. A woman's voice, barely audible beneath the white noise. She repeated one word. "Hollow." Over and over, like a prayer or a warning. I played it a dozen times, headphones jammed in, trying to extract meaning from the distortion. No metadata. No callback. But something about her voice. It didn't sound panicked. It sounded resigned. People had been vanishing along Route 17 for years, but no one paid attention until 2 children disappeared during a church retreat. Their van broke down near the forest, and the driver swore they were only out of sight for a minute. When they called it in, dispatch only heard static on the line. Just static, and that same word. Hollow. So I followed the trail, like I always do. I've been doing this job long enough to know what kind of things don't get written in police reports. I'm not a cop. I'm not FBI. I work alone. No badge, just scars, and a gut that tells me when something isn't natural. Miners Hollow lit that gut up like a lightning storm. I parked at the edge of town. The road ended in broken pavement, and wild roots that cracked through the asphalt like fingers trying to pull something up from underneath. Trees loomed like sentinels, watching, judging. I stepped out of the truck and into the silence. It was too quiet. No birds. No bugs. Not even wind. Just the sound of my boots crunching over the remains of a place long abandoned. Or at least, it should have been. Part 2. Footprints in the Dust. I started with the saloon. 2 stories of rotted timber and collapsed roofing, sitting like a drunk on crooked legs. Most of the buildings in Miners Hollow looked the same. Time and weather had done their best to erase it. But the saloon had something the others didn't. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. Long toes. Drag marks. Something walked on 2 legs, but moved like it was crawling half the time. I knelt down, brushing away a layer of fine gray dust, and felt the prickle of instinct run up my spine. Fresh. Maybe a day old. I followed them inside. The bar was still intact, oddly untouched by the decay that had claimed everything else. Glasses still lined the shelves, dust-covered and warped with age. A piano slumped in the corner, keys torn out like teeth. The light through the windows was dim, filtered through a veil of cobwebs so thick they moved like curtains when I passed. That's when I saw the hatch. Set into the floor behind the bar. Hidden under a mat that had been dragged back into place. Like someone wanted to hide it, but not well. I stepped behind the bar and crouched beside it. Old iron hinges. The wood around the edges was clawed. Deep gouges, splinters peeled back like something inside had tried to escape. Not just scratched, shredded. Violent. Desperate. The padlock that once sealed it shut? Melted. Not broken. Melted. I ran a finger along the rim and felt something cold. Sticky. Tar? No. Blood, mixed with ash. My flashlight buzzed to life in my hand, and I took a long breath, staring down at the hatch. I've opened hundreds like it. Crawl spaces, bunkers, root cellars, and worse. But this one watched me. That was the only way I can describe it. I hadn't opened it yet, but I could feel something waiting beneath it. Not moving. Just aware. Like a hand pressed against the underside, waiting for mine. I should have turned around. Walked back to the truck. Let the forest reclaim what it wanted. But I didn't. I gripped the edge, breathed deep, and pulled it open. Part 3: Descent. The hatch opened with a shriek. Wood straining against rusted hinges, like it didn't want to give up its secret. Beneath it, a shaft yawned wide. A ladder, iron and old, dropped into blackness. The air pouring out was cold and heavy, thick with the stink of ash, mold, and something else, something sour, like breath caught too long in a sealed coffin. I clicked my flashlight on and leaned over the edge. The beam vanished into the dark without touching bottom. I'd seen old mine shafts before, but this one felt wrong. Like it didn't just go down, it led somewhere. Somewhere deeper than earth. Deeper than bone. Still, I climbed in. My boots found the first rung, and I started down, one hand on the side, the other on the light. The walls around me were tight, scraped raw in places, like claws had dragged against the stone. Every few feet I saw handprints, deep and oily, human-shaped, but too large, stretched, like wax melting under a slow flame. The deeper I went, the colder it got. Not natural cold, no draft. This chill was still, heavy, like being watched by something that had never breathed. After maybe 30 feet, I hit the bottom. The tunnel was narrow, supported by beams blackened with soot. My light flicked across them, names etched into the wood in shaky hands. Miners, maybe? Or victims. Most of them were crossed out. I walked slowly, boots crunching over old bones, broken picks, and rusted helmets. The silence here wasn't silence at all, it pulsed. My ears rang with it, like standing in a vacuum. Then I heard the whisper. Just one word. Hollow. It wasn't behind me. It wasn't ahead. It was inside my head. I spun around, flashlight shaking, scanning the tunnel walls. Empty. No movement. No shadows that didn't belong. But something had spoken. I turned back toward the deeper tunnel and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A door. Wooden. Half-burned. Hanging askew on rusted hinges at the end of the shaft. It had no handle. Just carvings, lines scratched deep into the wood, forming a circle inside a triangle. An old symbol. Older than the town. Older than English. I stepped forward, breath fogging. Behind that door, something was moving. Something tall. Something waiting. Part 4. The door that breathes. The closer I got, the louder it became. Not a sound, exactly, more a sensation. A low pressure in my ears. Like the air itself was bracing for something. The door was warped, splintered by heat, and yet, It pulsed, in and out, just barely, almost imperceptible, like it was breathing. I raised my flashlight and traced the carvings again. Triangle, circle, scratch marks around it, almost like claw grooves. Or were they teeth? I touched the wood. It was warm, not from the heat of the earth. There was something alive on the other side. Or something that remembered what it was like to be alive. I pushed. The door didn't creak. It didn't groan. It exhaled. A gust of air rolled over me, stale, sweet, and clinging to the back of my throat like syrup. The taste of rot. Of old meat. Of time. I choked, stumbling back, eyes watering. But the door was open now. And behind it was a room that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't a mine shaft anymore. It was a chapel. Built from stone, dark and sweating with condensation. The walls were curved, and laid with symbols I didn't recognize, impossible geometry that made my head throb when I stared too long. And at the center of it all was the statue. 7 feet tall. Carved from black stone so dark it seemed to eat the light from my flashlight. A man, or something like a man, standing with arms outstretched. His face was a smooth, featureless oval. No eyes. No mouth. No expression. Just a single, round hole where the face should have been. Perfectly circular. A void. I took a step closer, boots echoing against the wet floor. The silence inside the chapel was complete. My breathing sounded too loud, like it didn't belong here. Every part of my body screamed to leave, but I couldn't. I was pulled forward like metal to a magnet. That's when the laughter started. High-pitched, childlike, but garbled. Wrong. Like a recording played backward. It echoed, not from the walls. Not from the tunnel. From inside the statue. Something giggled inside that stone shell. Something alive. Or something that used to be. And then the voice returned. Clearer this time. Closer. He wore my shape. Now I wear yours. Part 5. Echoes of the Self. I froze. The voice wasn't echoing in the room. It was inside my skull. Pressed against the meat of my brain like wet fingers tapping from the inside. My legs locked, breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. Then the statue moved. Barely. Just a shift of weight. A twitch of the shoulder. But the movement echoed, like stone grinding against stone, and dust flaked from the ceiling above. I took a step back, light shaking in my hand. The laughter stopped. The voice returned, softer now, coiling around my thoughts like smoke. You wear pain like skin. You carry your grief like a name. The void where the statue's face should have been, the hollow, seemed to widen. Not in size, but in presence. It pulled at my eyes like it wanted me to look deeper. Not just at it. Into it. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like they were wrapped in something thick and invisible. Syrup, tar, memory. My light began to dim. Not fade. Dim, like the beam itself was being devoured. Then the statue took a step forward. Not a statue. Not anymore. It walked like something learning how. Bones creaked. Limbs cracked. Its arms unfurled from the sides with deliberate slowness, fingers long and pointed, twitching like antennae. There were no eyes, and yet I knew it saw me. Knew me. Do you remember your brother? My mouth went dry. It couldn't know that. It shouldn't know that. I hadn't spoken his name in 10 years, not since the fire. Not since I left that part of my life buried in a whiskey bottle and a handful of nightmares. But the hollow man knew. He screamed in the smoke. He reached for you. You ran. No, I whispered. My voice cracked. I didn't. I tried. You left him. The chapel began to rumble. Stone cracking. Water dripping faster now. Symbols on the walls bleeding dark ichor, running down in lines that twisted and changed when I blinked. I aimed my shotgun, hands trembling, and fired. The shell hit the hollow man square in the chest. Stone exploded. Smoke and dust filled the room. I coughed, staggered backward, heart trying to pound through my ribs. And then, from inside the cloud, came that giggle. Now you're hollow too. Part 6. Something inside. The laughter didn't echo. It vibrated. It rolled through the stone floor, up my legs, into my spine. A sound too large for the space it came from, like something laughing from behind the world. I turned to run. Didn't even pretend to be brave. Just turned and sprinted down the tunnel, flashlight flickering wildly as my boots slapped the wet stone. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me. Not chasing. Following. Deliberate. Like it knew I couldn't outrun what was already inside me. I hit the ladder hard, scrambled up, slipped once, boot catching on a rung slick with moss or blood or both, but I kept going. My breath roared in my ears, drowning out everything. Except one sound. One voice. You wore his name like armor, but it was never yours. I burst through the hatch, back into the saloon. The dim gray daylight outside had faded to something darker. The sky was choked in clouds, and the forest leaned closer. I slammed the hatch shut, dragging an old shelf over it, heart still hammering in my chest. Silence. I stood there, hunched over, hands on knees, gasping. That's when I heard the door creak. Not the hatch. The saloon's front door. Just one slow, groaning inch. I spun, raising the shotgun, and stared into the threshold. Nobody. Just the forest. But the trees weren't still. Their branches twitched. Not in the wind. There was no wind. They shivered, pulsed, swayed like antennae. Like the forest was listening. Like it was awake. I backed toward the truck, keeping my eyes on the door, shotgun still raised. I didn't notice the bloody footprints on the floorboards until I stepped on one. Not the ones from before. New ones. Mine. Dozens of them, barefoot, dragging behind like something had pulled itself through the room. And every set of prints led back to the same place. To me. I looked down at my boots. Still laced. Still clean. I knelt, pressed my fingers into one of the prints. Warm. And when I pulled my hand back, my palm came away red. But not with blood. With ash. Part 7. Ash and Echoes. I stared at the ash in my hand. Not soot. Not dust. It was too fine. Too warm. It stuck to my skin like memory, impossible to wipe away. The more I rubbed, the more it spread, smearing up my wrist, painting my veins gray. Something was wrong with the light now. The sky outside had gone pale, not dark, not bright. Just drained. Like the sun was behind a wall of skin, and I was standing in the belly of something that had swallowed the sky. I stepped out of the saloon, shotgun still tight in my grip. The forest stared back. The trees were still shifting. But now they leaned inward, branches bent like arms in prayer. The whole town felt like the center of a ritual already in progress, and I was the last to realize I'd been invited. "He never screamed," the voice said again. "He waited. You ran. I tried to ignore it. I tried to pretend it wasn't mine. But the words were stitched into my thoughts now, sewn with some invisible needle that threaded through every guilt I ever buried. I stumbled toward my truck, parked right where I left it. But something about it had changed. The windshield was coated in a thick film of condensation from the inside. As I got closer, I saw fingerprints. Tiny ones, smeared in circles, like someone had been spinning in place on the passenger side. I gripped the door handle, heart pounding, shotgun raised. Flung it open. Nothing. Empty seat. No sign of movement. No smell. No warmth. But wedged between the seats was a cassette tape, labeled in smudged red marker. "Play me." I hesitated. Then I reached in, jammed it into the dash, and turned the key. The engine didn't start, but the tape did. And from the speakers came a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. "Hey, dumbass. You left your knife again. I swear I oughta duct tape it to your damn hand." My brother. Laughing. Alive. "Anyway, meet me at the quarry tonight. I think I found something." The tape clicked. Ended. I sat there in silence. The quarry. He died in that quarry. Burned alive in the collapse. I swore I'd stop. But if this tape was real, if his voice was real, then maybe what I'd buried wasn't dead. Maybe it was waiting. And maybe the Hollow Man wasn't done showing me the rest of myself. Part 8. The Ash Pit. The quarry was 12 miles out. I took the truck anyway. What choice did I have? I needed answers. I needed to believe the tape was real. That my brother's voice wasn't just some echo conjured by the Hollow Man to flay me open with grief. The road curved like a scar through the trees. The deeper I drove, the stranger it all became. The lines on the pavement twisted, splitting into jagged veins that pulsed when my tires rolled over them. The forest leaned in tighter, boughs scraping the truck roof like fingernails across bone. And the smell. Smoke. Not fresh, not distant, old smoke. The kind that clings to fabric and won't wash out. The kind that remembers the shape of flames. I crested the final hill and saw it. The quarry. A yawning mouth carved into the land. The place where everything ended, where my brother's body was never recovered, just swallowed by fire and stone. They said a gas pocket ruptured. That he was too deep in when it happened. That there was no chance. But they didn't know what we were really doing down there. They didn't know what we found. I parked near the rusted chain gate, the one that had once been padlocked and plastered with "No trespassing" signs. Now, the chain lay broken on the ground, and the signs were gone. I stepped out into the dark. Windless. dead quiet. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I reached the edge of the pit, I saw the descent path, a crude dirt slope leading down the quarry's spiral spine. And halfway down, still standing after all these years, was the old shack. Our shack. Me and my brother built it when we were kids. A hideout, a clubhouse, a secret place where we'd bring flashlights and stolen comic books. We hadn't been inside since we were teenagers. Since the fire. I started down the path. Each step felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to slow me. I was sweating, even though the air was cold. Every breath burned. The smoke was stronger now, curling up from the quarry floor like the fire had never stopped. I reached the shack. The door was cracked open. Inside was darkness, and something else. A voice. You finally showed up. I stepped through the door, and came face to face with my brother. Part 9. The Brother Below. He stood in the center of the shack, half lit by the dying beam of my flashlight. Same height. Same shaggy hair. Same cocky stance, weight on one foot, hands in pockets. Like we were 16 again, and none of this had ever happened. But there was something wrong with his eyes. Too still. Too empty. Like someone had painted a memory onto glass and propped it up in front of me. I raised the flashlight. What are you? He smirked. You always were the smart one. His voice was exactly the same, down to the rasp in his throat from years of smoking behind Mom's back. Every detail perfect. Too perfect. Didn't think you'd come back, he said, taking a step forward. The floor didn't creak. No sound at all, even as his boots moved over warped wood. Thought you buried me deep enough. I tried to save you, I said. You know that. You tried to save yourself, he replied. You ran. Just like always. The walls of the shack groaned. Or maybe it was the earth beneath. A deep, pulsing rumble began to stir in the pit outside, low and slow, like something was breathing underground. I lifted the shotgun, but my hands were shaking. You're not him. No, the thing said, grinning. But I remember how it felt to be. He raised his hand. Not in a threat. Just holding it up. There were holes in the palm. Not punctures. Not wounds. Perfectly round voids, like pieces of his flesh had been cleanly erased. No blood. No scarring. Just absence. You didn't just leave me, he said. You left the door open. The light inside the shack flickered. The bulb overhead, somehow still connected, still hanging, buzzed once and burst, showering sparks. The walls split. Literally split, seams cracking open along the corners, revealing a yawning blackness that pulsed and twisted with impossible angles. The inside of the shack had become larger than the outside. The floor dipped, the ceiling stretched, and something wet dragged across the boards behind me. I turned too late. Hands, not my brother's, reached from the walls. Long, too long. Each one ended in fingers with no nails, just skin stretching into points, like bone wrapped in wax. They didn't grab me. They caressed my back, my neck, my face. And then I heard the whisper again, echoing from inside every wall. Now you know how deep the hollow goes. Part 10. The shape beneath skin. I ran. Or tried to. The shack stretched as I moved, like the walls were rubber, or dreams, or some kind of warped memory that didn't want to let go. Every step took me deeper, not out. My brother, the thing wearing him, stood still in the center, arms wide like he was welcoming me home. Behind him, the boards curled inward, forming a tunnel of black timber, veins pulsing beneath the surface like they were alive. "It's better here," he said. "You don't have to carry it anymore. The grief, the guilt, the weight." The hands slid along the walls again. One of them brushed the back of my neck and I felt a jolt, a memory, but not mine. Smoke. Screaming. My brother's voice, raw and ragged, shouting my name as flames roared up the quarry shaft. "Don't leave me!" I hit the floor. Dropped to my knees, shotgun skidding across the wood. My head throbbed. My chest seized. Something was bleeding inside me, but it wasn't blood. It was belief. I was starting to believe. In the hollow. In what it took. In what it gave. The darkness around me folded inward. I looked up, and where the ceiling had been, there was now a sky of bone, arches of ribs stretching over a void, as if I stood in the ribcage of some dead god buried beneath the earth. My brother knelt in front of me. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was soft, grief-stricken. "You were just a kid," he said. "It wasn't your fault." My lips moved, but no words came out. "But you think it was. That's what called it." I stared at him. His skin began to peel, flake by flake, like ash falling in reverse. His eyes hollowed. His mouth stretched wide, not into a scream, but into nothing. No teeth. No tongue. Just a perfect round hole, like someone punched reality through his face. He reached for me. I didn't move. Couldn't. His fingers touched my chest, right above the heart. And suddenly, silence. The wind stopped. The heat. The color. Even the shape of the room ceased to matter. Because I was somewhere else now. Not physically. Deeper. Inside. And there I stood. Face to face with myself. Not a mirror. Not a trick. A second me. Older. Worn. Eyes sunken and skin gray with ash. My mouth twisted with bitterness. My hands stained black. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Because I already knew. He was what I'd become, if I stayed. Part 11, The Self That Watches. He looked like me, but heavier. Sicker. Like something had been feeding on him from the inside out, and left only enough to keep him walking. His skin sagged in folds, mouth bent downward in a way I've never seen a human expression move. Like gravity wanted him swallowed whole. He didn't blink. He just stared. And as he stared, something moved behind his eyes. Like fingers pressing from the inside of his skull, testing the walls. Searching for a crack. I said nothing. I couldn't. I just watched him, and he watched me, and the space between us felt tight, like the air was folding in. Like I was looking at a version of myself one decision away from becoming something else. "How many times did you think about it?" The words didn't come from his mouth. They rose from inside me. "How many nights drunk, gun on the table, staring at the door, waiting for something to come take you?" He stepped forward. I stepped back. But the space didn't change. The floor didn't move. The walls didn't shift. Only we moved, and yet somehow, we never got closer or further apart. "You didn't just leave your brother," You left yourself. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. You're not me. He grinned. The skin of his face split, tearing upward from the mouth to the temple. No blood. Just blackness underneath. Something twitched inside. Not yet. His hand reached out. And as it did, I saw the tattoos on his arm. My tattoos. Twisted. Burned. Rewritten. The compass I'd inked in college? Bent inward, pointing to nothing. The quote on my wrist. Still I rise. Now just a single word carved deep. Down. I tried to run. But my feet were rooted. My arms heavy. The world twisted again, not violently this time, slowly, like a screw turning in a socket that never ends. The ceiling crumbled into stars. The walls peeled into ash. And suddenly, I wasn't in the shack anymore. I was in the mine shaft again. But not the one from earlier. This one was clean. Fresh wood beams. Oil lanterns burning low. And echoing up from below. Voices. Familiar ones. Laughter. The sound of two boys. Race you to the bottom, loser! Hey, wait up! And then, a scream. And fire. And I remembered. The hollow didn't just show you your grief. It made you live it again. And again. And again. Until you broke. Part 12. The loop that bleeds. The air shifted. I was 16 again. Boots too big, lungs full of adrenaline, legs pumping dust behind me as I sprinted down the shaft, after my brother. I remembered this moment. Every stone, every breath. Only this time, it was slower. Dragged out like a dream you can't wake from. The lanterns flickered above, glowing gold against damp wood, and the ground shook beneath me. Hey! I screamed. Wait, stop! I knew what came next. He was just ahead, flashlight bobbing in hand, laughing like we didn't already know the place was unstable. Like it was just a game. We thought we'd found something, a strange cave behind one of the old bracings, a hidden room. Carved stone. Symbols. He went in first. And I hesitated. Just 1 second. Just long enough to see it move in the dark behind him. Then the blast. The ground gave way. I remember the flame. How it held up the tunnel like it was alive. Like it was hungry. I remember the scream. Noah! But this time, I wasn't just remembering. I was standing there, watching it happen. And then I was back at the mouth of the shaft. Again. Same start. Same laugh. Same sprint. Same hesitation. I ran it again. And again. Each time, a little slower. A little heavier. Until it wasn't a memory anymore. It was a ritual. Like I was being sacrificed to my own past. The hollow man watched. I could feel him, standing somewhere beyond the veil of time, dragging a long, crooked finger through my choices like chalk on a blackboard, underlining each failure. I screamed. Cried. Pounded the walls. Tried to change it. I even dove after my brother once, face first into the collapsing earth. But the world warped mid-fall, snapping me back to the start like a stretched rubber band. Back to the shaft. Back to the moment. Until finally, I didn't chase him. I didn't run. I just stood there, watching him vanish. His voice echoing behind me. Aren't you coming? And I whispered back. No. The tunnel faded. The light dimmed. And I felt something crack inside me. A wall, maybe? Or the last piece of who I was before this all began. Behind me, a hand touched my shoulder. Cold. Long-fingered. The hollow man spoke without sound. You are ready now. Part 13. Through the hollow. The hand on my shoulder didn't squeeze. It didn't pull. It just rested there. Like it had always been there. Like I just now remembered it. I turned slowly and faced him. The hollow man. No longer a statue. No longer a shadow behind my thoughts. He stood full in the dark, towering, stretched. Bones too long. Arms that swayed like rope. skin pulled tight and glossy, as if wax had been molded over a skeleton. His chest rose and fell with something like breath, though I knew it wasn't air that filled him. His face, a void. Still featureless. Still perfectly round. Still hungry. But now, something looked back at me from within it. Me. A version of myself twisted by time and silence. Bent under the weight of guilt. Ash-colored and hollow-eyed, trapped in the shape of a thing that once tried to save someone and failed. The hollow man didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because now I understood. He wasn't here to punish me. He was here to replace me. To take the weight I couldn't carry anymore. That's what the hollow did. It waited for grief to ferment into guilt, and when it was ripe, it carved out the rot and wore it like skin. I stumbled back. Why me? I asked. Why this? A silence passed that felt older than the world. And then, at last, it answered. But not with words. With understanding. The hollow is not a thing. It's not a curse. Not a spirit. It's a shape. A space carved out by sorrow, made real by repetition. An emptiness so deep it begins to walk, to crawl, to laugh with stolen lungs and speak with borrowed tongues. And when it finds someone like me, it offers a gift. Freedom. Relief. Forget your name. Forget your pain. Step out of the fire and into the ash. No more grief. No more guilt. Just hollow. I felt the floor dissolve beneath me. The world stretched again. Not up or down, inward. And the hollow man opened his arms. I nearly stepped forward. One more inch, and I would have become him. But then, a bark. Sharp. Familiar. Davy. My dog. My companion. My tether to the world above. I snapped back. The hollow man's head tilted. Curious. Disappointed. Not yet. Part 14. Teeth in the silence. The bark echoed again. Sharper this time. Real. Alive. Not a memory. Not a trap. I followed it, blindly. Heart pounding, legs heavy like they were carved from the same stone that birthed the hollow. I ran through the dark, through the mine, through the chapel that had become a ribcage, the ash-stained walls bleeding smoke that whispered my name. The hollow man didn't chase. He didn't have to. Because he had left something behind. Doubt. The tunnel around me twisted again, but this time I was ready. I reached the ladder, the real ladder, I prayed, and climbed. My fingers bled against the rusted rungs, but I didn't stop. When I burst into the saloon, it was night. Real night. Stars overhead. Wind in the trees. The world had color again. Cold blue and black and silver. And there, on the porch of the truck, stood Davy. Tail wagging. Tongue out. Alive. He barked again, but not in joy. In warning. I turned. The hatch was still open. And something was crawling out. Not the hollow man. Something smaller. Faster. Split-skinned children. 3 of them. Naked, twitching. Hands too big. Their mouths weren't mouths, just vertical holes stretched open to the neck, lined with dozens of tiny, twitching teeth. Not made to speak. Only to mimic. One opened wide and my voice came out. Please, help me. Another followed, whispering in my brother's voice. Don't leave me again. I backed toward the truck. Davy growled, low and primal, the kind of growl dogs make when they know something doesn't belong to the world they were born into. I didn't wait. I climbed in, slammed the door, turned the key. The engine stuttered. Once. Twice. And then roared to life. The children screamed, not loud, but high. Shrill, like glass splintering in your skull. I hit the gas. The truck tore from the saloon, headlights slicing through the trees. In the rearview mirror, I saw the 3 creatures skittering back toward the hatch, limbs bending backward, folding like spiders. Then the forest swallowed them, and Miner's Hollow disappeared in the dark. I didn't stop driving until the sky turned gray. Didn't speak. Didn't cry. Just breathed. because for the first time in what felt like years, I was full of something other than ash. But I knew I hadn't escaped. Not really. The hollow had opened. And it knew my name. Part 15. The Man Who Returned. It's been 3 months since I left Miner's Hollow. The forest is gone now, burned in a freak wildfire, they said. The old mining town? Nothing left but ash and foundation stone. No records, no maps, not even the road that led there. As if the land itself rejected it. Or buried it. But I still see him. In reflections. In corners. In the space just after a blink, when my eyes adjust and shadows hold their breath. The hollow man watches. Not chasing. Just waiting. Because something followed me out. Not the children. Not the laughter. Not even the fire. The shape. The one I saw inside myself. It comes in waves. Days when I can't feel anything. When I forget the sound of my own voice. I'll look in the mirror and see a face I know is mine, but feels worn by something else. I've started covering mirrors. I've stopped sleeping in silence. Davy stays close. Won't leave my side. He growls at empty corners, whines at the closet door, paws at the basement like something underneath it is breathing again. Sometimes, I hear my brother's voice on the radio. Just a whisper. It's not done with you. I believe him. I still carry the cassette. I've played it 100 times. Sometimes it's him. Sometimes it's static. Once, it was just the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I live on the road now. New towns. Short stays. Never too long. Never near forests. Always ready to run. Because it's not over. You don't escape the hollow. You carry it. It waits in the places between memories. In the cracks between thoughts. In the grief you never buried deep enough. And one day, when I'm too tired to fight it, when the guilt curls around my ribs like a nest, it'll come back. Wearing my face. Speaking with my voice. And laughing with my brother's breath. When that day comes, God help anyone who hears it whisper. Let me in. The end.